A cylinder of ice, 3.2 kilometers below the surface of East Antarctica, holds air that last moved freely 800,000 years ago. It was drilled slowly, carefully across several field seasons, and when the segment was finally sealed and transported to a laboratory, the scientists who opened it were in a precise and literal sense, breathing the same atmosphere as creatures that no longer exist on this planet. That detail is small, and it refuses to go away. If a continent can preserve a single breath for 800,000 years, what else might it still be holding? And why have we only just begun to learn how to ask? Antarctica has always been described as the end of the world. But there is another way to hold it as a missing chapter 1 that Earth wrote carefully, in ice and stone and pollen and trapped air, and then sealed shut before anything could disturb the pages. Tonight we follow 4 traces into that chapter. The fossil record of a continent that once held real forests, the ice itself as a sealed atmospheric archive nearly 1 million years deep, the subglacial lakes hidden far beneath dark, pressurized and possibly still alive, and the buried river valleys carved into bedrock by water that stopped flowing long before our species arrived. We will not resolve what any of this ultimately means. That is not what this space is for. We are not here to prove that Antarctica leads somewhere dramatic. The record does not ask for drama. It asks for patience, the same patience required to drill 3 kilometers through compressed snow or to match a volcanic ash layer preserved in Antarctic ice to the same eruption recorded in a cave deposit on the other side of the planet, or to recognize that a pollen grain the width of a human hair can carry information about whether the temperature at a given latitude on a given morning 40 million years ago was warm enough for a southern beach to flower. Antarctica resists narrative. That is in part what makes it worth a quiet hour. The continent began somewhere else entirely. Before it was cold, before it was white, before it became the most isolated place on Earth, it was part of a larger arrangement of land Gondwana connected to what would eventually become Africa, South America, Australia, India. In that earlier configuration it sat farther north in contact with milder oceans, receiving enough warmth to support dense forest trees with growth rings, ferns, insects, rivers that ran through all seasons. This is not a hypothesis drawn from inference alone. The physical remains are recoverable fossilized woodleaf impressions, pollen grains extracted from sediment quarries drilled at the continent's margins, preserved well enough that researchers can identify individual species and reconstruct which seasons were long. The forest did not vanish suddenly. That is one of the quieter things the record preserves. They retreated. Pollen diversity declines across the layers slowly at first, then more steeply as though the continent were exhaling, shedding complexity in increments over millions of years. Some lineages held on longer than others. Some migrated northward as the cooling deepened, carrying genetic signatures that can still be found today in plant families whose common ancestor stood on ground that is now buried under 4 kilometers of ice. And then there is this beneath that ice, beneath the bedrock itself. In some regions water is still moving. More than 400 subglacial lakes have been identified under the Antarctic ice sheet. Some are small, others stretch for hundreds of kilometers. One of them, Lake Vostok, may have been sealed in total darkness for 15 million years. Satellites have detected the surface of the ice above it rising and falling by meters as the lake slowly fills and drains through channels no instrument has directly observed. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurement. The question Antarctica keeps generating is not whether something significant is preserved beneath the ice. The record has already confirmed that something is. The question is what we are capable of reading, and how much the act of reading might change what remains. The ice cores that extend back 800,000 years are among the most precise climate records the planet has ever produced. They show that for most of that span, atmospheric carbon dioxide rose and fell within a recognizable range, responding to shifts in Earth's orbit, to volcanic events, to the slow mechanics of glacial cycles. They show that temperature and greenhouse gases are tightly coupled, not a theoretical relationship, but are demonstrated one layer by layer for nearly 1 million years. They show that climate transitions are not always gradual. Some of them, the record suggests, happened within decades, and in the uppermost layers the most recent something appears that does not resemble the cycles beneath it. Antarctica does not interpret that observation, it simply preserves it. The traces we follow tonight move from the surface downward, from the forest through the ice into the water beneath the ice, and finally into the shape of the buried land below the water river, channels pressed into rock that has not felt rain in 35 million years. Each layer holds a different kind of question. None of them resolve cleanly. We will not arrive tonight at a conclusion. We will arrive instead at the shape of the question held open, as the record holds it without closure. Now we follow the first trace. The continent that learned to disappear. The first thing to understand about Antarctica is that it did not freeze, not in the way that water freezes in a glass left outside. Overnight, sudden, total, final. What happened to Antarctica was slower than that, and in some ways more consequential because it was the result not of temperature alone, but of position of movement of a continent gradually changing its relationship to everything around it. The cold was not the beginning of this story. The cold was a consequence, and to understand what Antarctica may still be holding, we have to go further back than the ice to the time before the cold arrived, when this continent was something else entirely. Antarctica was once part of a larger arrangement of land that geologists call Gondwana, a southern supercontinent that joined what are now Antarctica, Africa, South America, Australia and India into a single continuous landmass surrounded by systems that circulated heat very differently than they do today. This was not a brief or marginal configuration. Gondwana persisted for hundreds of millions of years, and during that time Antarctica was not at the edge of the arrangement. It was near its centre, connected on multiple sides, traversed by rivers that ran towards seas that no longer exist in those positions. Heat moved across it. Species crossed between its neighbours through it. Whatever climatic extremes its polar position created were moderated by proximity to warmer land masses and by ocean currents that had no reason yet to avoid it. The separations began slowly and did not happen all at once. Rifts formed first fractures in the crust where tectonic tension had been building beneath the surface for millions of years, where magma eventually rose and cooled into the new rock, widening the gaps by centimetres per year until those centimetres became oceans. Africa pulled away first, then India, then South America, then Australia. Each separation was not merely geographical. Each one changed the way heat moved through the surrounding ocean, redirected currents that had previously distributed warmth to southern latitudes and removed another moderating influence from the continent's climate. Antarctica was not cooling because it moved south exactly. It was cooling because everything that had kept it from being cold was slowly being taken away. The final and most climatically significant separation came when the passage between Antarctica and South America opened fully. Before that opening, a ring of circulating water around the continent was possible in fragments but never continuous. Once the passage widened, the fragments connected. Water began to flow uninterrupted around the entire landmass, and as it did, it formed something that did not exist anywhere else on Earth, a self-reinforcing thermal barrier, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. As that ring of cold, fast-moving water is now called, did not merely cool the region, it isolated the continent from the planet's heat-sharing systems in a way no other landmass has experienced before or since. Warmer water that had previously reached Antarctic shores was deflected northward. The continent found itself enclosed inside a refrigerator of its own geography's construction, and the door once closed was very difficult to reopen. Snow that fell in autumn no longer melted fully by spring. Ice that formed at higher elevations no longer retreated entirely to the coast during summer. Accumulation began to outpace melt first in the highlands, then across wider regions, and once the ice sheets grew large enough to cover significant surface area, they began reflecting sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it. That reflectivity reinforced the cooling, which encouraged more ice, which increased the reflectivity further. A feedback loop engaged, and over thousands of years, not overnight, but also not gradually in any way that the forests remaining at that time could fully adapt to the continent crossed into a new thermal state. The process that had been a slow drift became in geological terms the locking. But the continent beneath that ice had not been erased. It had been covered, and that distinction matters more than it first appears. In places where ice advanced slowly, where it crept across the land, rather than grinding through it at speed, the surface beneath was not scoured away but buried. Soils that had formed under those ancient forests were sealed in place before they could be weathered further. River sediments that had accumulated over millennia were compressed under the weight of ice before biological processes could fully decompose their organic content. Pollen grains that had fallen from trees into lake beds and river margins were pressed into those sediments and held there in conditions cold enough to slow their decay nearly to a standstill. In some of those buried horizons, those pollen grains are still recoverable today, not fossilized in the traditional sense, but preserved well enough that their outer walls remain structurally intact, their shapes identifiable, their plant families assignable by any researcher trained to read them. This is the context inside which the 4 traces we follow tonight are positioned. The traces move through different materials and operate on different timescales, but they share a quality that is worth naming. Before we enter any of them, they are all pieces of a record that was kept without any intention of being kept. A pollen grain that settled into sediment 30 million years ago was not archived for future study. It was simply caught by cold, by pressure, by the absence of the organisms that would otherwise have broken it down and returned it to the soil. An air bubble sealed inside glacial ice 800,000 years ago was not preserved for comparison with modern atmosphere. It was simply enclosed the way any pocket of gas is enclosed when the material around it compresses and solidifies. The evidence exists not because any process decided to maintain it, but because the conditions in Antarctica happen to favour preservation over loss concealment, over exposure holding, over releasing. That asymmetry between other continents and this one is not incidental. It is in a precise sense what makes Antarctica's record worth following. Other landmasses continued their biological and geological activity after the major transitions. New forests grew over old soils, rivers, carved new channels through ancient ones, erosion and tectonic movement, and the constant recycling of surface material overwrote earlier chapters. Antarctica's deep freeze interrupted that cycle. It did not stop the continent's story, it slowed the revision of it dramatically, and in doing so, left some of the earlier drafts intact. We begin with the forests because they represent the oldest recoverable layer of that story, and because starting with something that was undeniably alive, trees with growth rings, understories with ferns and insects, rivers running through soil that had depth and chemistry and biological history, makes the question of what came after them sharper and more specific. The forests are not a metaphor for what Antarctica lost. They are physical evidence of what the continent once was, and from their remains the first trace begins, what the pollen remembers. Pull a core of sediment from the right location along Antarctica's margins, from the exposed rock faces at the continent's edge, where ice has retreated just enough to reveal what lies beneath. And somewhere in that material at the right stratigraphic depth you will find pollen. Not the pollen of moss or lichen and the cold-tolerant survivors we associate with polar environments today. The pollen of trees, of southern tube beeches with broad leaves adapted to capturing light across long summer days, of conifers whose relatives still grow in the temperate forests of South America and New Zealand, of ferns whose fronds required soil with real depth and moisture to sustain themselves season after season. The grains are microscopic, often no wider than a human hair, and they have been sitting in that sediment for tens of millions of years. But their outer walls, made of a substance called sporopollenin, one of the most chemically resistant organic materials known, have survived intact, and under a microscope their shapes are as readable as the day they fell. This is the first trace, and it begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with a methodological one. The recognition developed gradually across the latter half of the 20th century that pollen grains preserved in Antarctic sediments could be extracted, identified and used to reconstruct the vegetation of a continent that no longer has any. The technique is called palynology, and it had been applied elsewhere for decades before researchers began applying it systematically to Antarctic cores. What they found as the datasets accumulated from multiple drilling sites around the continent's margins and from sediments recovered below shallow coastal waters was not ambiguous. Antarctica had supported forests, not marginal wind-stunted growth at the tree-line equivalent of a polar environment, but dense, layered, functioning ecosystems with canopy trees, understory plants, soil fauna, and all the biological complexity that implies. The pollen record is most readable there are continent's edges at locations like Pridd's Bay on Cis Antarctic coast where ocean sediment cores have been drilled to depths that reach well below the level at which permanent glaciation began. In those deeper layers, the pollen assemblages are rich and diverse, with multiple tree genera present simultaneously, their relative proportions shifting across the layers in ways that reflect not catastrophe but climate variability. Wetter periods, drier periods, cooler summers, warmer ones, the ordinary fluctuation of a functioning ecosystem, adjusting to conditions that change slowly enough to be accommodated. Higher in the core as the layers approach the period of major ice sheet formation, the diversity begins to narrow. Some genera drop out entirely. Others persist, but in smaller proportions. The record does not show a sudden extinction. It shows a long retreat, a gradual shedding of complexity as the margin of survivability contracted around the remaining species. What makes this especially precise as evidence is that pollen grains are not merely identifiable, they are quantifiable. Researchers can calculate the relative abundance of each species at each depth, which means they can trace not just the presence or absence of a plant community, but its changing composition over time. A pollen layer dominated by southern beech with a diverse understory tells a different story than a layer where beech dominates alone, or where beech has declined, and only cold-tolerant shrubs remain. The transitions between those layers carry information about how quickly the ecosystem changed and which species were most vulnerable to cooling. In the deepest and oldest layers sampled from Antarctic margins that diversity is highest, a detail that aligns with independent evidence from oxygen isotopes and deep-sea sediment records, suggesting that global temperatures were several degrees warmer during those periods than they are today. The fossil wood adds a complementary dimension that pollen alone cannot provide. At several locations along the transantarctic mountains, where peaks push through the ice sheet and expose rock that has been buried since the early phases of glaciation, fossilized tree trunks and root systems have been found in positions that suggest they grew in place. Not that they were transported there by ice or water. These are not fragments carried from elsewhere and deposited by glacial movement. These are trees that stood on this ground, grew their annual rings in this soil, and fell here when they died. The growth rings are measurable, and what they reveal is a pattern of strongly seasonal growth, wide rings from summer months of continuous daylight, narrow rings from the reduced photosynthesis of autumn, no rings at all from the dark months, then the resumption of growth in spring. The trees were adapted to polar light cycles, which means they were adapted to a world where Antarctica's position near the pole was already a reality, but where temperature had not yet made that position uninhabitable. One detail from this fossilized wood record is particularly difficult to set aside. Some of the tree specimens found in the transantarctic mountain exposures show growth ring patterns, suggesting lifespans of several centuries. These were not pioneer species colonizing a marginal environment for a brief window between glacial cycles. They were long-lived, established members of a forest that had been present long enough to produce multi-generational canopy trees, which implies in turn that the conditions supporting them were stable across timescales of hundreds of years, not decades. The climate that produced those forests was not a brief interlude. It was a prolonged state. The pollen record and the fossil wood taken together describe a continent that was biologically active, ecologically complex, and climatically stable enough to sustain slow-growing, long-lived organisms for extended periods, and that then lost all of that, not in a single event, but through a narrowing so gradual that each individual step might have seemed recoverable. That pattern of gradual loss recorded in accumulating sediment layers is the first trace this episode follows, and it establishes something that the traces which come after will need to account for whatever is preserved beneath the Antarctic ice today was not simply buried by catastrophe. It was buried by time, and time left it remarkably intact. The second trace enters the same system through a different material entirely, not pollen or wood, but the air itself caught and held for longer than any forest has ever stood. The air that did not escape. At the Concordia Research Station, positioned on the East Antarctic Plateau at an elevation of 3,233 meters above sea level, the air is so dry and so cold that a breath exhaled in winter freezes before it disperses. The station sits near the summit of the ice sheet, not near a mountain peak, but at the apex of an accumulated dome of compressed snow that has been building layer by layer for a span of time longer than our species has existed. Beneath the station, drilling operations have extracted cores from that dome, that extend more than 3 kilometers into the ice, and at the bottom of those cores in segments of ancient ice so compressed that the individual annual layers are barely distinguishable from one another. There is air. Actual air sealed in bubbles no larger than pinheads that last moved freely through an open atmosphere somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million years ago. That air is measurable, its composition is known, and what it says about the atmosphere of the deep past is among the most precisely documented things we have learned about this planet in the last 50 years. The mechanism of preservation is not complicated, though. Its implications are extraordinary. Snow falls on the Antarctic plateau and accumulates in layers. In the upper meters of the ice sheet, the snow is still porous. The spaces between crystals are connected to the atmosphere above, and air moves through them freely. As more snow accumulates and the weight above increases, those spaces compress. The snow transitions to a denser granular material called firn, and then to solid ice. Somewhere in that transition, typically at depths between 60 and 100 meters, depending on temperature and accumulation rate, the connected air spaces close off into isolated bubbles. The atmosphere above at the moment of closure becomes the atmosphere preserved below. It does not exchange with later layers. It does not migrate through the ice over time. It stays fixed in place, a physical sample of Earth's atmosphere at a specific moment, held in conditions that prevent chemical alteration almost entirely. What researchers extract from those bubbles by carefully melting or crushing ice core segments in controlled laboratory conditions are direct measurements of past atmospheric composition. Carbon dioxide concentrations, methane levels, nitrous oxide. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes, which carries information not just about atmospheric chemistry, but about the volume of ice locked up globally. At the time the snow fell, because when more water is stored as ice, the isotopic signature of the remaining ocean water shifts in a measurable direction, and that signal's recorded in the precipitation that falls on the ice sheet. A single ice core segment properly analysed can yield temperature reconstructions, greenhouse gas concentrations, dust load estimates, and volcanic chronology simultaneously. No other archive on Earth combines that range of information in a single continuous physical record. The climate signal that emerges from the full depth of the Antarctic ice core record is not subtle. Over the 800,000 years currently accessible through deep drilling at sites like Dome C, the location of the Epique core, one of the longest continuous ice cores yet, recovered Earth has cycled through 8 complete glacial and interglacial periods. In each cycle, temperatures declined gradually over tens of thousands of years, as ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere, then rose more sharply as the ice retreated and warmth returned. Carbon dioxide levels tracked those temperature changes with a consistency that appears across every cycle without exception, lower during glacial maxima, higher during interglacials, rising and falling in patterns that align with orbital variations in Earth's path around the Sun. The relationship between greenhouse gas concentration and global temperature is not inferred from these cores. It is read directly from them cycle after cycle with a regularity that removes statistical ambiguity. One feature of that record deserves particular attention in the context of what Antarctica may still be telling us. The transitions between glacial and interglacial periods were not symmetric. The descents into cold, the long, slow accumulation of ice over tens of thousands of years, look different in the ice core record than the returns to warmth. Warming events in some cycles occurred faster than cooling events by a significant margin. Some interglacial transitions show temperature increases, compressed into periods of a few thousand years. A few show changes that appear at the resolution available in compressed deep ice to have occurred within centuries. The ice does not dramatize these transitions. It simply records them with the same indifference it applies to everything else, which is part of what makes the asymmetry worth noting, because asymmetry in a physical record is information, not interpretation. The dust layers add a separate dimension. During glacial periods, when ice sheets expanded and the land surfaces surrounding them became colder and drier, wind patterns strengthened and the amount of dust carried through the atmosphere increased substantially. That dust settled onto the Antarctic ice sheet and was incorporated into the annual layers, leaving chemical signatures that can be matched to source regions, the Patagonian steppe, the Australian outback, Central Asian deserts, depending on their mineral composition. A core drilled in East Antarctica therefore contains not only a record of Antarctic conditions, but a record of aridity and wind patterns in distant continents, synchronized to the same timeline through the shared stratigraphy of the ice. The ash layers from major volcanic eruptions appear in the same cores as the independent time markers, and when those ash layers are matched between Antarctic cores and Greenland cores, the same eruption appearing in both hemispheres, they confirm that the two records are reading the same planetary events from opposite ends of the Earth. What this second trace adds to the first is a different quality of temporal depth. The pollen record reaches back tens of millions of years, but is recovered in fragments core segments from scattered drilling sites, exposures at mountain outcrops, sediment sequences of variable continuity. The ice core record reaches back only 800,000 years in its current form, but within that span it is essentially unbroken. Annual layers accumulate, compress, and deepen in an uninterrupted sequence that researchers can read like a very long, very slow sentence. The air inside those layers has been waiting under 3 kilometers of ice for someone to develop the tools to ask it a question, and when those tools arrived, the air answered in a language that turned out to be measurable to parts per million. The third trace descends further still below the ice, below the bedrock that the ice rests upon, into water that has been sealed from the surface for longer than the ice above it has existed. The lakes that did not freeze. The ice above Lake Vostok is moving. Not quickly, the surface displacement is measured in millimeters per year, but continuously flowing outward from the center of the East Antarctic ice sheet towards the coast in a slow grinding procession that has been underway for millions of years, and yet the lake beneath it has not frozen. Under nearly 4 kilometers of ice in complete darkness under pressure, approximately 400 times greater than atmospheric pressure at sea level, liquid water has been persisting according to current estimates for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. The ice above moves, the water below stays liquid. That combination on a planet where liquid water is among the most contingent of substances dependent on narrow temperature ranges and specific pressure conditions describes something that does not fit easily into the category of simple geological curiosity. Lake Vostok is the largest of more than 400 subglacial lakes now identified beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, and its scale alone is disorienting. The lake extends approximately 250 kilometers in length and 50 kilometers in width, with depths in some regions exceeding 1 kilometer. Its surface area is comparable to Lake Ontario. It has a water column. It has a sediment floor. It has what appear from remote measurements to be circulation patterns areas, where water is slightly warmer near geothermal heat sources at the lake's southern end and slightly cooler near its northern reaches. These are the structural features of a lake, not a meltwater pocket or a thin film of pressurized water between ice and rock. Lake Vostok is a body of water in the full sense of that phrase, and it has been one in complete isolation from the atmosphere and from every surface ecosystem on Earth for a span of time that exceeds the duration of many species currently alive. The mechanism that keeps it liquid is the intersection of two forces operating independently. The first is geothermal heat rising from Earth's interior, not dramatic volcanic activity, but the slow, persistent thermal output of the planet's core, which reaches the base of the ice sheet in quantities sufficient to melt small amounts of ice continuously. The second is pressure. At the depths where Antarctic ice transitions from sheet to lake interface, the weight of the overlying ice lowers the melting point of water below the temperature of the ice itself, meaning that ice in contact with the lake melts, not because it is warm, but because it is compressed. These two forces together create a stable thermal environment at the lake's base, stable enough to have maintained liquid water through multiple glacial cycles, through periods when global temperatures shifted by several degrees, through the entire span of time that human ancestors were developing stone tools on a different continent. The third trace becomes complicated here, and deliberately so because what lies beneath the ice at Vostok and at the other subglacial lakes distributed across Antarctica, lakes like Lake Ellsworth beneath West Antarctica or the Willemsbers. Ice stream lakes that drain and refill on timescales of years rather than millennia is not just water, it may be inhabited water. Samples recovered from the accretion ice directly above Lake Vostok ice that formed from lake water that refroze against the base of the overlying sheet have been analysed for biological markers. What those analyses found was not sterile mineral chemistry. They found DNA sequences. Fragments of genetic material belonging to bacterial lineages, some of them related to organisms found in other extreme environments on Earth. Some of them sufficiently distinct that their relationships to known life are not immediately clear. The samples were not taken directly from the lake itself, which remains undrilled to preserve contamination protocols, but from the refrozen material at the ice-water interface, which is to say from water that had been in contact with the lake before freezing back into the sheet above it. The complication this introduces is not simply the possibility of life. It is the possibility of life that has been evolving in isolation for a duration comparable to the age of recognizable mammal lineages. If microbial communities have persisted in Lake Vostok since the lake was first sealed from the surface, they have had 15 to 25 million years to adapt to their environment, without any genetic exchange with surface ecosystems. Mutations that would be quickly eliminated in a population regularly mixing with other populations might persist and accumulate in a sealed system. Metabolic strategies that are energetically inefficient by surface world standards might be the only viable options in a nutrient-poor, light-absent environment and therefore become fixed. The organisms potentially present in Antarctic subglacial lakes if they exist, and if they have been isolated for the durations the geology suggests, may represent something genuinely without parallel evolutionary lineages that have been proceeding on their own trajectory in the dark under kilometers of ice for longer than most surface ecosystems have existed in their current form. That possibility does not resolve cleanly in either direction. The DNA fragments recovered from accretion ice samples are real, reproducible findings that have been published in peer-reviewed literature, but the interpretation of fragmentary genetic material from an environment as unusual as a subglacial ice interface carries significant uncertainty. Contamination, the introduction of modern surface microbes into sample material during drilling or laboratory processing, is a persistent methodological concern that researchers in this field acknowledge directly and work to mitigate but cannot eliminate entirely. The more provocative interpretations of the Vostok accretion ice data have been challenged, revised, and in some cases partially retracted as analytical methods improved. What remains after those revisions is less dramatic than the initial report suggested, but not nothing. What the third trace introduces into this episode then is a layer of fundamental inaccessibility. The forests of the first trace are recoverable through pollen and fossil wood extracted from sediment cores. The atmosphere of the second trace is recoverable through ice core analysis. The subglacial lakes of the third trace are for the moment largely not recoverable, not because the technology to reach them does not exist, but because reaching them risks changing them irreversibly. And what makes them scientifically valuable is precisely their having remained unchanged. The record here is not sealed by distance or depth alone. It is sealed by a protection dilemma that the other traces do not share, and that dilemma shapes what we can know and what for now we may have to continue holding as a question without a clean answer. The fourth trace descends in a different direction, not into water, but into stone, and into the shape of a landscape that has not seen rainfall for 35 million years. The fourth trace and the shape of what remains. Radar waves travel through ice at a speed of approximately 168 million meters per second, slower than through open air, but fast enough that when a signal is sent downward from an aircraft flying over the Antarctic ice sheet and bounces back from the rock beneath, the round trip takes only a few microseconds. By measuring the time that return takes and by flying those survey lines repeatedly across the continent in overlapping grids, researchers have assembled maps of a landscape that no human eye has ever directly seen. Those maps show mountains, they show valleys, they show the branching dendritic patterns of drainage networks. Networks shaped not by ice, which carves differently, but by water flowing downhill under the influence of gravity, cutting channels into rock over timescales long enough to produce the gentle meanders and tributary confluences that are the signature of a river system in a temperate landscape. Beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, those river signatures are still there, pressed into bedrock that has not felt rain since before the ice arrived. This is the fourth trace, and it operates differently from the first three. Pollen and fossil wood are biological. They record life directly, the presence of organisms that lived and died in a specific place and left physical remnants behind. Ice cores are atmospheric. They record the chemistry of air at the moment it was sealed, preserving a sample of conditions rather than organisms. Subglacial lakes are hydrological and potentially biological. They record the persistence of liquid water and the possibility of life within it. The buried river networks are purely morphological. They record the shape of landscape carved by processes that are no longer occurring preserved beneath ice that arrived after the carving was complete and has been protecting the carved surface from further modification ever since. They are not evidence of life. They are evidence of a climate, specifically of a climate warm enough and wet enough to sustain flowing surface water across a continent now defined entirely by the absence of both. The convergence of all four traces brought together here for the first time produces something that none of them produces individually. Considered separately, each trace is compelling but limited in its implications. Pollen records establish that forests existed but say relatively little about the hydrology that sustained them. Ice cores document atmospheric composition across 800,000 years, but do not reach the deeper periods when the forests were present. Subglacial lakes demonstrate the persistence of liquid water in extreme conditions, but in a form so transformed by isolation that it bears little resemblance to the surface hydrology of Antarctica's green period. The buried river networks, however, connect to all three of the others in ways that tighten the picture considerably. Rivers require the conditions that produce the forest's temperatures above freezing precipitation falling, as a rain soil capable of absorbing and releasing water seasonally. The same climate that the pollen record describes is the climate that carved those river channels, the same transition that the ice cores document in reverse. The long cooling, the shift in atmospheric chemistry, the progressive deepening of cold is the transition that ended the surface hydrology, whose signature the radar maps now reveal. And the subglacial lakes that persist today in their pressurized darkness are in some cases positioned in the deepest portions of those ancient valleys occupying topographic lows that the rivers carved, and that the ice subsequently filled with something other than flowing water. Placed side by side, the four traces describe a single coherent transformation seen through four different lenses. A continent that once had forests, rivers, and a water cycle operating at the surface is now a continent where the forests are preserved only as microscopic grains in sealed sediment, where the atmosphere of that earlier world survives only in bubbles trapped inside ice, where the rivers are recorded only as shapes pressed into rock beneath kilometers of frozen water, and where liquid water persists only by retreating to the most extreme conditions available, sealed under pressure, in the dark, slowed to metabolic rates that make geological time feel almost intimate. What those four lenses together suggest is not that Antarctica lost its living past catastrophically. They suggest that it hid it. Incrementally, under increasing weight, each layer of evidence was covered by the next, until the covering itself became the most prominent feature of the continent. The buried river networks introduce one specific detail that the other three traces do not. In the radar imagery of East Antarctic bedrock, particularly in the data collected over the gamberts of mountains, which rise to elevations of nearly 3 kilometers beneath the ice, without a single peak breaking the surface, the drainage patterns visible in the rock below show a landscape that was not only warm and wet, but topographically mature. The river valleys there are not shallow incisions suggesting recent or brief water flow. They are deeply cut with the characteristic profiles of systems that have been operating long enough to reach something close to equilibrium with their underlying geology. That kind of valley development takes time, not thousands of years, but millions, and the topographic maturity of those buried networks implies that the surface hydrology of Antarctica was not a transient episode between glaciations, but a sustained condition that persisted long enough to fundamentally shape the continent's physical structure. What the convergence of all four traces establishes, then, is less a collection of separate findings than a single-layered argument that Antarctica's current frozen character is a relatively recent overprint on a much longer prior history, that the evidence of that prior history was not destroyed by the transition but sealed within it, and that what is preserved beneath the ice, in sediment, in bubbles in water, and in stone, is the record of a planetary system operating under conditions that no longer exist on this continent, and may not exist anywhere on Earth in quite the same configuration. The record does not speak in one voice, it speaks in four, each from a different depth and a different material, and what they say in combination is coherent enough that the question is no longer whether the missing chapter exists. The question is how much of it we are capable of reading before the conditions that preserved it begin under a warming climate to change. Before we can follow that question further, we need to pause. The traces we have laid out are real, the evidence is documented, and the pattern they form is genuinely difficult to dismiss. But there are serious researchers who would look at each of these traces and offer a different account of what they mean, and those accounts deserve the same careful attention we have given the traces themselves. What the careful objection says. A geologist who has spent a career studying Antarctic sediment cores would listen to the 4 traces described in the preceding chapters and offer with patience rather than dismissal a set of observations that complicate the picture considerably. The first and the most fundamental of those observations concerns familiarity. The findings described here fossilized pollen from ancient forests, air bubbles in ice cores documenting glacial cycles, subglacial lakes beneath the ice sheet. Radar-mapped river networks in buried bedrock are not fringe discoveries reported in obscure publications. They are mainstream Antarctic science, published in the most rigorously reviewed journals in the field, replicated across multiple research groups, and largely uncontested in their basic factual content. The skeptical position is not that these things are false. The skeptical position is that they are being framed in a way that implies more mystery than the data actually supports. The forests, the careful objector would note, are not mysterious. They are expected. The theory of plate tectonics predicts that Antarctica, having once occupied a more northerly position within Gondwana, would have experienced climates warm enough to support vegetation. The fossil record confirms that prediction. The transition from forested continent to glaciated one is explained with reasonable completeness by the opening of the Drake Passage between Antarctica and South America, the establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current, and the subsequent thermal isolation of the continent, a sequence of events that is well dated, physically well understood, and consistent with what the sediment record shows. The forests are not a missing chapter. They are a known chapter that simply ended. Framing their preservation as something sealed or hidden imports a sense of concealment into what is mechanically a straightforward burial process. Ice covered land stopped being modified. This is geology, not mystery. The ice core record, the same careful voice would continue, is perhaps the most thoroughly understood portion of the evidence presented here, and understanding it well actually reduces, rather than expands, the sense of anomaly. The relationship between greenhouse gas concentrations and temperature visible across 800,000 years of ice core data is not evidence of something unknown. It is the empirical foundation on which modern climate science rests. The cycles are explained by Milankovitch orbital variations, the feedbacks are modelled and understood. The volcanic time markers match independent geological records on other continents. The spike in carbon dioxide visible in the uppermost ice layers is striking in context. But the context itself, the 800,000-year baseline, is the product of a physical archive that scientists created, interpreted and validated through decades of painstaking methodological refinement. The record says what it says precisely because researchers were careful enough to understand its limitations as well as its strengths. Presenting it as a mysterious sealed document rather than a well-characterized scientific instrument understates the degree to which it has already been read. The subglacial lakes, the objection continues, are where the most significant caution is warranted, and where the gap between what the data shows and what it is sometimes reported to show is widest. The DNA fragments recovered from Lake Vostok accretion ice samples were genuine detections, but the scientific community's subsequent engagement with those findings has been substantially more cautious than the initial reports suggested. Multiple reanalyses identified contamination as a plausible explanation for a significant portion of the sequences. The organisms whose genetic signatures appeared most exotic, those described in some accounts as representing entirely novel lineages, were in later analyses more parsimoniously explained as surface contaminants introduced during drilling operations. What remains after the most rigorous scrutiny is not zero, but it is considerably less dramatic than the headline findings implied. The lakes are real, their isolation is real, and the question of whether they harbour life is scientifically legitimate. But the current evidence does not establish that they do. It establishes that the question has not been definitively answered, which is a different claim. Each of these objections deserves weight. They are made by a people who know the material better than most, and they are grounded in methodological rigor rather than reflexive conservatism. The mainstream account of Antarctica, a continent whose green past is explained by plate tectonics, whose atmospheric archive is well characterized by climate science, and whose subglacial environment remains incompletely sampled but not demonstrably inhabited, is coherent, internally consistent, and supported by the preponderance of published evidence. None of the 4 traces described in the preceding chapters requires an exotic explanation to be accommodated within that account. And yet there are edges to each objection that the objection itself does not fully address. The pollen record being expected does not explain why the diversity in the deepest accessible layers is higher than current models of Gondwana climate predicted before those cores were drilled, a discrepancy that has prompted ongoing revision of paleoclimate reconstructions for the Eocene and Oligocene. The ice core record being well understood does not account for the asymmetry in glacial-interglacial transitions noted in Chapter 3. The faster warming events that remain the subject of active modelling work precisely because the standard orbital forcing explanation does not fully reproduce their speed. The contamination hypothesis for Lake Vostok accretion ice samples, while scientifically defensible, does not explain why some of the sequences found are most closely related to organisms from deep-sea hydrothermal environments, rather than from the Antarctic surface, which is where drilling-introduced contamination would typically originate. The buried river networks in the Gamburtsev Mountains show a topographic maturity that the standard timeline of Antarctic glaciation, which would have limited the period of surface water flow significantly, does not comfortably account for without additional assumptions about pre-glacial erosion rates. None of these edges constitute proof of anything. They are places where the mainstream explanation fits well, but not perfectly where the data requires the model to work a little harder, where the answer that is most probably correct and the answer that fully accounts for every observation are not quite the same answer. The pattern is not confirmed by these edges. It is not refuted by the objections either. It remains in the position it has occupied throughout, genuinely unresolved, held open by details that are too small to overturn the mainstream account and too persistent to disappear into it. That is where we continue from. What remains after the objection? Taking a skeptical argument seriously, genuinely seriously, not as a rhetorical courtesy before dismissing it, changes what you are left with. It does not always leave you with less, admittedly, as it leaves you with something more precisely shaped. A smaller claim, yes, but one whose edges are cleaner, whose foundations are more honestly assessed, and whose remaining uncertainty is uncertainty of a different quality than the uncertainty you started with. The objections laid out in Chapter 6 are real and they matter. They trim the 4 traces. They remove the most dramatic interpretations. They considerably position the subglacial lake findings from provisional discovery to genuinely open question. What they do not do, and this is worth examining carefully, is dissolve the pattern entirely. After the skeptic has finished speaking, something remains on the table. The question is what to make of it. The most important thing the skeptic's position clarifies is the distinction between 2 different kinds of claim. The first kind is archaeological or biological. The claim that Antarctica contains specific hidden revelations in inhabited lakes, preserved ecosystems intact enough to be compared to living ones, physical remnants of prior geological periods that will overturn existing models when accessed. That kind of claim is what the skeptic most effectively challenges, and the challenge lands. The evidence does not currently support those strong-form conclusions, and presenting the traces as though they do would misrepresent what the data actually says. The second kind of claim is structural. The claim that Antarctica's physical record is more continuous, more complete, and more capable of resolving outstanding questions in paleoclimate, planetary biology, and Earth system science than has historically been appreciated, and that the process of reading that record is still in early stages. That claim the objections leave largely intact. The distinction matters because the structural claim is in some ways the more significant one. Individual discoveries, a new species in a subglacial lake, a specific atmospheric event preserved in ice. A particularly well-dated pollen sequence would be interesting additions to existing knowledge. But the structural claim is about the quality and continuity of the archive itself, and about what kinds of questions become answerable when an archive of that quality is systematically engaged. Antarctica's ice sheet in the regions where it is oldest and least disturbed preserves a record of Earth's atmospheric conditions that extends beyond what any other physical archive provides. The pollen-bearing sediments at the continent's margins contain biological information about a period of the transition from warm Eocene to cold Oligocene that is sparsely documented elsewhere because most other continents were too geologically active during that period to preserve continuous depositional sequences. The buried topography revealed by radar survey represents a landscape that was shaped by processes no longer operating anywhere on the continent's surface, which means it preserves geomorphological information that could not be reconstructed from any currently accessible surface feature. After the skeptic speaks, these structural facts are unaffected. The forests existed, the ice holds continuous atmospheric data, the buried river networks are real, the subglacial lakes are real. The question of what inhabits them is unresolved but legitimate. These are not contested claims dressed in mystery. They are the cleaned-up residue of the traces after the most dramatic interpretations have been set aside, and the residue is still substantial. There is a particular quality to evidence that survives a serious attempt at dismissal. It is not the same as evidence that was never challenged, and it carries a different kind of weight. The pollen grains in Prid's Bay sediment cores were not initially accepted as straightforward indicators of Antarctic forest cover. Early researchers considered and debated the possibility of transport from other land masses of reworked sediment of identification errors. Those alternatives were addressed methodologically over decades of work until the consensus reached its current form. The pollen is in situ, the species are identified correctly. The forests were real. The Apiaca ice core's greenhouse gas record was subjected to intense scrutiny regarding drilling fluid contamination sample handling protocols and the possibility of in situ chemical alteration of trapped gases. The methodology was refined in response to those critiques until the record it produces is now one of the most validated datasets in paleoclimatology. Evidence that has passed through that kind of sustained critical engagement is not the same as evidence that has simply not been challenged yet. What the recovery from the skeptic chapter looks like then is not a reassertion of the original claims in louder form. It is a recognition that the traces after being correctly trimmed by the objections still describe a coherent and unresolved situation. Antarctica holds physical records of Earth's past that are demonstrably more complete in certain respects than those available from other continents. The reading of those records is incomplete, limited by access by technology by the very conditions of preservation that make the records valuable in the first place. The questions those records raise about atmospheric history, about the pace of ecological transition, about the long-term behavior of ice sheets under varying forcing conditions, and about the limits of life in extreme and isolated environments are not resolved by the skeptic's position. They are clarified by it. Stripped of their more speculative framing, they become sharper, and in some ways more interesting, because a precisely stated unresolved question is more productive than a vaguely implied mystery. One thread that the skeptic's position specifically does not address is temporal. The objections are calibrated to the current state of knowledge, to what the evidence shows now with the tools and sample access currently available. But Antarctica's subglacial environment has never been directly sampled in the way that would be required to answer the life question definitively. The oldest and most climate-relevant portions of the ice sheet have not yet been reached by drilling. The sediment sequences beneath the ice that would bridge the gap between the ice core record and the deep pollen record remain largely unsampled. The objection that the available evidence does not support strong conclusions is accurate. It does not follow that the evidence not yet available will say the same thing, and it is the evidence not yet available sealed beneath a continent still mostly undrilled, still mostly unmapped at the resolution that would answer the outstanding questions that the next chapter turns toward. The traces trimmed and clarified point forward. What the continent is still saying. The Southern Ocean does not behave like other oceans, encircling Antarctica without interruption, unbroken by any continental landmass. It is the only ocean on Earth that connects all three of the major ocean basins, Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian, into a single circulating system. Water from the surface of the Southern Ocean sinks in specific locations near the Antarctic coast, where it becomes dense enough through cooling and increased salinity, and descends to the deep ocean floor in currents that then travel northwards beneath the surface for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years before eventually upwelling in distant latitudes. This process, the formation of Antarctic bottom water, is one of the primary drivers of the global thermohaline circulation, the planetary scale ocean conveyor that redistributes heat, nutrients, and dissolved gases across the entire oceanic system. What happens at the edges of the Antarctic ice sheet does not stay there. It propagates outward through the ocean at depth across timescales that span centuries, reaching the seafloor of the Atlantic and Pacific in quantities that influence productivity, oxygen levels, and temperature at distances of 10,000 kilometers from the source. This matters for the traces we have been following because it reframes the scope of what Antarctica's record is actually documenting. The Ice Core Archive of Atmospheric Chemistry is not just a record of conditions above the Antarctic plateau. It is a record of the global atmospheric system. At each moment those layers were deposited, because the atmosphere mixes on timescales shorter than the annual accumulation of ice layers. The carbon dioxide concentration trapped in an ice bubble at Dome D 800,000 years ago was not the carbon dioxide concentration of Antarctic air. Specifically, it was the carbon dioxide concentration of Earth's atmosphere globally at that moment. The dust layers in those same cores sourced from Patagonia and Central Asia and the Australian interior were delivered to the Antarctic ice sheet by atmospheric circulation patterns that connected those distant surfaces to the polar accumulation zone. The ice in Antarctica is local in its physical location and global in its informational content, and that combination is part of what makes the record so difficult to replicate anywhere else. The expansion this chapter follows begins from that observation and moves in two directions simultaneously: outward toward the global systems connected to Antarctica's behaviour, and downward toward the portions of the record that have not yet been accessed. Both directions lead to the same recognition that the four traces described in earlier chapters are not the complete picture of what Antarctica holds. They are the accessible portion of a much larger archive, most of which remains sealed beneath conditions that current technology approaches but has not yet penetrated. The Beyond Millennia Ice Project, a coordinated international effort involving research groups from multiple countries focused on drilling a new ice core from a site in East Antarctica, selected specifically for its potential to preserve continuous ice, older than any core yet recovered, represents the most direct current attempt to extend the accessible portion of that archive. The target is ice formed during a period known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, roughly between 1.2 and 0.8 million years ago, when Earth's glacial cycles changed in a way that remains incompletely explained. Before that transition, glacial cycles occurred approximately every 41,000 years, driven by changes in the tilt of Earth's rotational axis. After, its cycles lengthened to approximately 100,000 years, driven primarily by changes in the eccentricity of Earth's orbit. The transition between those two rhythms, the shift from a 41,000-year world to a 100,000-year world, is one of the most significant unresolved questions in quaternary climate science, and the ice cores currently available do not reach back far enough to capture both sides of it in the same continuous record. The site selected for this deep drilling in the vicinity of a location called Little Dome C, near the existing Epica drill site but positioned over older, slower accumulating ice, is estimated to potentially hold continuous ice extending back 1.5 million years, which would place the full span of the mid-Pleistocene transition within a single retrievable core for the first time. Drilling at that depth requires working through ice, so compressed that annual layers, still individually distinguishable at shallower depths of thin to millimeter scale or less. The signal-to-noise ratio in the atmospheric data extracted from those deepest segments will be lower, and the temporal resolution will be coarser. But the information that would be gained direct atmospheric measurements from both sides of the transition, allowing comparison of greenhouse gas concentrations and temperature patterns before and after. The shift in glacial frequency would address questions that have been active in the field for decades without resolution. The expansion here is not speculative. The drilling project is underway. The site has been selected on the basis of ice flow modelling that predicts the age of the deepest layers. The methodology for analysing the compressed deep ice has been developed through experience with existing cores and refined in anticipation of the more challenging material below. What the expanded record would provide, if the modelling is correct, is a direct observational window into a planetary transition that currently exists only in indirect proxy records assembled from ocean sediments and scattered terrestrial archives, none of which offer the atmospheric precision that ice cores uniquely provide. Alongside the reach toward older ice, there is a parallel expansion in the mapping of what lies beneath the existing ice sheet. The radar surveys that revealed the Gambutsev Mountains and the buried river networks of East Antarctica have continued to improve in resolution and geographic coverage, and recent survey campaigns have begun to reveal features in the subglacial landscape that were not visible in earlier, coarser datasets. Among those features are what appear to be ancient lake sediment deposits in topographic lows predating the current ice sheet sediment accumulations that predate the glaciation, and that may preserve biological and chemical records of the Antarctic environment from the transition period itself, the interval when forests were retreating and ice was advancing, the chapter whose beginning and end are documented but whose middle remains largely unread. Accessing those sediments would require drilling through the ice above them, and sampling material that has been physically isolated from the surface for tens of millions of years. The contamination challenges would be more severe than those faced at Lake Vostok. The methodological requirements would be more stringent. The timeline for achieving it extends beyond current funding cycles and into the research programs of scientists who have not yet begun their careers, but the sediments are there detectable by their acoustic signature in radar profiles sitting in the dark beneath ice that is itself sitting in the dark beneath the southern sky, waiting in the manner of all preserved things, without impatience, without awareness of being waited for, simply persisting in the condition that has protected them this long. The pattern now seen from a wider angle is beginning to show something that the individual traces could only suggest. The pattern that has no explanation, yet consider a single number, 96 years. That is the current best estimate derived from the highest resolution sections of the Epicure Sea ice core for the duration of one of the most rapid atmospheric transitions recorded in archive. A period during which carbon dioxide concentrations rose by approximately 20 parts per million temperatures, over the Antarctic plateau shifted by several degrees, and the dust content of the accumulating ice dropped sharply, indicating a simultaneous reorganization of global wind patterns. 96 years, 3 or 4 human generations. A span of time short enough that had someone been present at its beginning, their great-grandchildren might have lived to see its end. In the context of a record that measures its timescales in hundreds of thousands of years, 96 years is not a gradual transition. It is an event. What makes that number significant is not its brevity alone. Rapid climate transitions are known studied, and in broad terms, expected. The physics of feedback systems allows for non-linear responses under certain conditions, and the ice core record contains multiple examples of abrupt shifts that climate modelers have been working to reproduce for decades. What makes this particular measurement worth dwelling on is what happens when it is compared to the corresponding signal in records from the other end of the Earth. In the Greenland ice cores drilled from the opposite polar ice sheet preserving a Northern Hemisphere atmospheric archive, with comparable resolution to the Antarctic record, the same transition appears. The same shift in greenhouse gas concentration. The same reorganization of dust patterns, the same temperature signal inverted in sign, because the two hemispheres were not warming and cooling in strict synchrony during glacial cycles, but present in the record. And when the two signals are precisely dated and placed on the same timeline using the volcanic ash layers that appear in both archives as shared time markers, the transition appears in Greenland within a range of years, not decades, not centuries, that overlaps with its appearance in Antarctica. Two ice sheets separated by the full diameter of the Earth show the same atmospheric event within the same narrow window of time. The atmosphere mixed globally on timescales of roughly a year is the only medium through which a signal could propagate between the two poles that quickly. But the specific mechanism, what caused the reorganization, what triggered the shift in both hemispheres nearly simultaneously, and what physical process transmitted a signal of that magnitude through the atmospheric system in a period shorter than a typical human lifespan is not resolved. The models that reproduce glacial interglacial cycles in their broad outlines do not reproduce the speed of these transitions with fidelity. The physics that would explain 96 years is understood in principle, but not in its operational details. and the operational details are exactly what would be needed to understand whether this kind of event is predictable, whether it has precursors that could be identified in advance, and whether the conditions that produced it in the deep past could be assembled again. The bipolar synchrony, as this pattern of near-simultaneous climate events in both polar records is called in the literature, is not a marginal observation made once in one dataset and subsequently contested. It appears across multiple transitions in the Antarctic record, each one documented in both hemispheres at resolutions that improve as drilling and analytical techniques advance. What varies between transitions is the degree of synchrony. Some events are more tightly coupled between the two poles than others, in ways that are themselves not fully explained. During certain glacial cycles, the Antarctic and Greenland records show an offset, the so-called bipolar seesaw, where Antarctic temperatures rise, while Greenland temperatures fall, and vice versa, tracking an alternation driven by changes in ocean heat transport through the Atlantic. But during other transitions, the seesaw breaks down, and the two poles move in the same direction at nearly the same time, connected by something other than the gradual redistribution of heat through ocean circulation, which operates on the timescales of centuries to millennia and is far too slow to account for synchrony measured in decades. What that something is remains in the most honest assessment of the current literature genuinely not known. The candidates include rapid reorganizations of atmospheric circulation patterns, changes in the global distribution of sea ice that alter the reflectivity of the polar region simultaneously, or feedbacks involving the methane cycle. Methane being a greenhouse gas that is produced in tropical and northern wetlands, and whose concentration in the ice core records sometimes changes faster than carbon dioxide and in ways that are not fully coupled to the local temperature signal. None of these candidates individually accounts for all instances of bipolar synchrony in the record. The combination of candidates that would account for all of them has not been assembled into a physically consistent model that reproduces the ice core observations without requiring assumptions that the data do not independently support. There is a detail within this pattern that carries a specific weight. The fastest transitions in the Antarctic ice core record those occurring within time windows of less than a century do not cluster randomly through the archive. They appear preferentially at the transitions between glacial and interglacial periods, which is the phase of the climate cycle when the ice sheets are changing most rapidly, when sea level is rising or falling most quickly, and when the global distribution of ice is in greatest flux. The coincidence of maximum ice sheet dynamism with maximum atmospheric reorganization speed is consistent with the hypothesis that ice sheet changes are not merely responding to climate transitions, but actively driving them, not a passive thermometer, but a participant in the very events it records. That possibility, if confirmed by future modelling and ice core data, would require a substantial revision of the conceptual framework within which glacial cycles are currently understood, not a refutation of existing science, a deepening of it in a direction that makes the system considerably more complex than current models capture. This is the peak of what the traces taken together point toward, not a specific hidden object beneath the ice, not a biological discovery or a geological anomaly that will resolve into clarity on closer inspection. The pattern is a question about the pace at which Earth's climate system reorganizes itself faster in some transitions than the mechanisms we currently understand should allow, preserved in two ice sheets on opposite ends of the planet, speaking to each other across 96 years in a language that science is still learning to read. After this, the traces do not climb further. They begin instead to resolve into something quieter, the landscape, not the evidence. At a certain distance, a mountain range stops being a collection of individual peaks and becomes a single thing, a profile, a shape against the sky, a gesture that the land is making. The individual summits are still there. The geology of each one is still distinct. But the eye, pulling back far enough, stops cataloguing and starts perceiving. And what it perceives is something that the close examination of any single peak could not have revealed. There is a version of Antarctica that becomes visible only from this kind of distance, not the continent of specific traces and individual datasets, but the continent as a coherent shape in Earth's history, a shape that can be seen whole only after the individual findings have been set aside and the larger outline allowed to emerge. The four traces we have followed are the fossilized forests, the atmospheric archive in ice, and the sealed subglacial lakes. The buried river networks in radar-mapped bedrock are not at this distance four separate arguments. They are four aspects of one condition, They each describe from a different angle and in a different material the same fundamental situation that a continent which was once a fully functioning participant in Earth's biological and climatic systems underwent a transition so thorough that its prior state became invisible from the surface, preserved only in forms that require extraordinary technical effort to access. The forests did not simply die. They sank beneath accumulating ice and became sediment chemistry and pollen geometry. The rivers did not simply dry up. They became topographic signatures in rock that no water has touched in 35 million years. The atmosphere of Antarctica's green period did not simply change. It became a set of bubbles in ice indistinguishable to the naked eye from the ice surrounding them, waiting for a technology that would not exist for most of the time they were waiting. The continent did not lose its past. It compressed it downward layer by layer into forms that grow more difficult to read the further back they go. Seen as a landscape rather than as evidence, this compression has a particular quality that none of the individual traces quite captures on its own. It is the quality of deep preservation, not the dramatic preservation of a flash-frozen mammoth, which is sudden and complete and requires no special conditions to interpret, but the slow-layered preservation of a system that was still functioning as it was being buried. The pollen grains in those Prid's Bay sediment cores were not deposited in a single catastrophic event. They fell season by season from trees that were still alive onto water surfaces and soil horizons that were still active, accumulating across spans of time long enough to record climate variability within the interval of preservation itself. The ice layers in the Epicene core were not laid down in a moment of crisis. They accumulated as they always had, snowfall compression burial simply continuing a process that had been running for hundreds of thousands of years, unaware that the record they were building would eventually be read. Preservation in Antarctica's case was not exceptional. It was the ordinary continuation of ordinary processes under conditions that happened to inhibit the destruction that elsewhere kept pace with accumulation. What that means, viewed from sufficient distance, is that Antarctica's record is not a collection of anomalies. It is what Earth's baseline looks like when the revising processes are removed. On other continents, the past is constantly being overwritten by new vegetation, by erosion, by tectonic activity, by the biological recycling of organic material, by the simple fact that living systems consume their own substrates and transform them into something else. The past that survives elsewhere survived, despite active pressure against its survival. Antarctica's past survived because the pressure against it was removed first by isolation, then by cold, then by ice that covered the remaining surface processes and held them in suspension. The record is not more exceptional than other records. It is less modified. And that distinction at distance shifts how the entire archive feels, less like a mystery that needs solving, and more like a silence that was always there waiting for the noise around it to quiet down enough to be heard. There is a geographic dimension to this landscape view that the individual traces do not individually emphasize. Antarctica is not distributed uniformly. East Antarctica and West Antarctica are geologically distinct, climatically distinct and differently preserved. East Antarctica, older, thicker, colder. Sitting on a single coherent craton holds the oldest ice, the deepest sediment sequences the most ancient buried topography. West Antarctica, younger, thinner, geologically fragmented, sitting partly below sea level on a series of disconnected basins, holds the most dynamic ice, the most vulnerable glaciers, the most active subglacial hydrology. The continent's two halves are not simply two portions of the same archive. They are two different kinds of record preserving different aspects of Earth's past and responding differently to present conditions. East Antarctica is the deep library. West Antarctica is the active laboratory. Together they constitute something that neither alone would be a system, with both temporal depth and present-day dynamism capable of informing questions about deep history and near-future change simultaneously. Pulling back to this landscape view also clarifies what the skeptics' objections were and were not engaging with. The objections addressed specific claims, the interpretation of DNA, fragments in accretion ice, the framing of forest fossils as malicious, rather than expected the tendency to imply hidden revelations in findings that mainstream science has already substantially explained. Those objections were correct about the specific claims, but they were addressed to the individual peaks, not to the profile. The profile Antarctica is an unusually complete, unusually accessible record of Earth's long-term behaviour. Still mostly unread, still mostly unsampled at the depths and resolutions that would answer the outstanding questions was not what the objections were aimed at, and it is not what they diminish. The shape of the continent's archive seen whole is larger than any single finding within it, and more durable than any particular interpretation of those findings. What remains at this distance and at this point in the night is not a set of claims to be evaluated or a mystery to be resolved. It is a recognition quiet, specific, and difficult to fully articulate that the planet kept records we were not meant to find in conditions we were not designed to access across timescales our intuition was not built to hold. Antarctica did not do this deliberately. It did it the way all preservation happens by accident, by the accumulation of ordinary processes, under extraordinary conditions, by the simple persistence of material that was never given a reason to disappear. That recognition has a texture, and it is worth sitting in it for a moment before the last traces of this episode dissolve into something still slower. What the ice teaches about time. There is a point in any long engagement with deep time where the human scale stops being the reference point. It does not disappear. We remain human thinking in human increments, anchored to the rhythms of days and seasons and lifetimes, but it stops being the measure against which other durations are understood. When you work long enough with the Antarctic record, when you spend enough time reading ice that was compressed from snow that fell before your species existed, something shifts in how time feels. Not how it is intellectually understood. Scientists are trained to handle large numbers without losing precision, but how it sits in the body pool, how it affects the quality of a question. The question, what happened here, starts to feel less like a historical inquiry and more like something else, something for which the vocabulary of history is slightly too small. Archaeology is the practice of reading the past from its physical remains. It works on the assumption that the past left traces, that those traces are interpretable, and that interpretation brings us closer to understanding what the past was. That assumption holds well enough within certain timescales, the centuries and millennia, within which human civilizations have been constructing, discarding, and leaving behind the objects and structures that archaeologists recover. It begins to strain at the edges when the timescales extend beyond anything human-made, when the traces are not artifacts but sediment chemistry, not inscriptions, but isotope ratios, not architectural remains, but the shapes of valleys carved by rivers that stopped flowing before our genus appeared. At those timescales, the discipline that resembles archaeology most closely is no longer history. It is something closer to cosmology, the study of how systems of enormous scale and duration behave, how they come to be in the configurations we find them, and what those configurations imply about the processes that produced them. Antarctica sits at the boundary between those two modes of inquiry. Its most recent layers, the upper few hundred meters of ice covering the last several thousand years, are close enough to human time to feel historical. The volcanic ash layers in those upper sections correspond to eruptions recorded in human documents. The atmospheric signals from the last 2 centuries show the unmistakable signature of industrial activity connecting the physical archive to events within living memory. At that depth, the ice feels like a record we could almost recognize as ours. But below that thin upper layer, the record extends into durations that no human framework was designed to hold, into cycles that predate our species by orders of magnitude, into landscapes whose last surface modification occurred in geological periods named for rocks, rather than events into a preserved silence, so long that the concept of waiting loses its meaning entirely, because waiting implies an awareness of time passing, and nothing in the deep ice is aware of anything. What philosophy offers at this depth, and it does offer something, though not a resolution, is a reorientation of the question. Science asks what the record contains and how to read it. Philosophy asks what it means that a record exists at all. What kind of universe produces systems that preserve their own history in forms accessible to the sufficiently patient and technically equipped descendants of organisms that lived millions of years later on the same planet under entirely different conditions? The question sounds abstract, but it is grounded in something quite physical. The pollen grain in the Prids Bay sediment did not survive because anything protected it. It survived because the conditions happened to be wrong for the organisms that would have decomposed it, wrong temperature, wrong moisture, wrong biology. The air bubble in the Epiaika core did not survive because the ice was designed to hold it. It survived because the mechanics of snow compaction happen to seal gas pockets before they can migrate through the crystal lattice. Preservation in every case is the accidental byproduct of processes that had no intention of preserving anything. And yet the result is an archive. There is something in that accidental quality that resists easy assimilation. A designed archive, a library, a database, a museum reflects intentionality. Its contents were chosen, organized, and maintained by someone with a purpose. An accidental archive reflects only the physics of the system that produced it. The intersection of accumulation rates and destruction rates that happen to favor retention over loss in this particular location and these particular materials. But the information content of the accidental archive is not diminished by its accidental origin. The pollen grain knows nothing about palynology, but it carries everything a palynologist needs to reconstruct the forest it came from. The air bubble has no awareness of climate science, but it contains the exact atmospheric chemistry that climate scientists require to extend their records beyond instrumental measurement. The archive does not need to have been intended to be useful. It only needs to have survived. That observation moves slowly towards something that feels less like science and less like philosophy, and more like the condition that both of them circle around without quite naming. The universe, or at least this portion of it, has a tendency to preserve, not universally, not without exception, not in ways that override entropy or circumvent the eventual decomposition of all material things, but preferentially in specific conditions under specific combinations of temperature and pressure and chemistry. Past states are held not forever, but long enough. Long enough that a civilization arising millions of years after the fact can drill into the holding and read what was there. Long enough that the question of what Antarctica once was is not purely hypothetical, not purely reconstructed from inference, but answerable to some degree from physical material that bridges the distance between then and now. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. But the recognition itself that the planet kept records of its own prior states informs we're only now learning to read, and that those records are still mostly unread, sealed under conditions that resist our access. While yielding incrementally to our patience carries a particular quality in the late hours when attention is loosening, and the categories that separate the scientific from the contemplative are less rigidly maintained. Antarctica does not ask for wonder. It does not invite it or resist it. It simply continues to be what it is, a compressed column of time holding the shape of a question that the planet posed to itself long before anything on its surface was capable of asking questions. The last trace is not an argument, it is an image. The core in the cold room. Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility in Europe, the temperature held at -50 degrees Celsius, the humidity regulated to prevent any further compression of the material inside, there are shelves of ice, not decorative ice, not commercial ice, but sections of core pulled from 3 kilometers below the surface of East Antarctica, each segment roughly 10 centimeters in diameter, and between 60 and 100 centimeters long, wrapped in protective tubing and catalogued with the precision that irreplaceable things require. The segments are numbered, their depths are recorded, the date they were drilled, the drill site coordinates, the handling protocols applied between extraction and storage, all of this is documented. And inside each segment, invisible without the right equipment, are the air bubbles, hundreds of them per cubic centimeter. Each one, a sealed chamber containing a small quantity of atmosphere from a specific moment in the deep past held in place by the ice surrounding it, which has itself not changed in any significant way since the snow that became it fell on the Antarctic plateau somewhere between 200,000 and 800,000 years ago. Those bubbles will not be opened tonight. They will remain sealed as they have been sealed for the entirety of human history and for hundreds of thousands of years before human history began. The researchers who will eventually analyze the segments not yet opened have not in many cases yet begun their scientific training. The questions those future analyses will address are not fully formed. They depend on what current analyses reveal, and current analyses are still in progress. And progress in this field is measured in field seasons and funding cycles and the slow accumulation of methodological refinement across careers. The bubbles are patient in the way that only things without awareness can be patient, not waiting exactly but persisting, which is something different and in some ways more complete. Consider what a single bubble contains. A volume of ancient air, perhaps a few nanoliters compressed inside a cavity in the ice crystal lattice. carbon dioxide molecules that were in the atmosphere during a glacial maximum when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea levels were lower than they are today. And the ancestors of every species currently alive were living in configurations that have not existed since. Nitrogen proportions nearly identical to those of the modern atmosphere, because nitrogen is chemically inert enough that its ratio has not changed meaningfully across the timescales the ice core covers. Possibly traces of volcanic sulfur from an eruption that occurred somewhere on Earth's surface, an eruption that no organism alive today witnessed, that left no monument that is remembered only in this, a faint chemical signal in a bubble of gas in a core of ice, in a cold room on a continent far from where most of the eruption's effects were felt. The bubble holds all of this without effort, without intention, without any of the qualities we associate with memory, and yet it is in every meaningful sense a memory. A record of a moment. A physical sample of a world that no longer exists in that form preserved, not because anything chose to preserve it, but because the conditions happen to require preservation as a side effect of simply persisting. There is a quality to this that deepens in the stillness of late hours. During the day with attention fully engaged. The ice core is an instrument, a tool for measuring past atmospheric composition, for extending the climate record, for testing models of glacial dynamics. Its scientific value is foremost, and that value is real and substantial and not diminished by anything else it might also be. But in the quieter register available when the mind is beginning to release its grip on the specific and the technical, the ice core becomes something else as well. An object whose age exceeds the imagination's ability to fully inhabit, containing traces of a world so distant that the distance is not merely historical but ontological, a different arrangement of the same matter that currently constitutes everything alive and everything built and everything thought on this planet's surface. The molecules in that bubble were in the open atmosphere before the first member of our genus drew breath. They will still be molecular, still subject to physics, long after the last thing we have made has been broken down and redistributed into other configurations. The bubble's persistence is not fragile. It is within human timescales essentially absolute. Antarctica itself is not sleeping. This is something the continent's popular image obscures. The ice is moving slowly in centimetres per year, but continuously flowing outward from the high plateau toward the coast in streams and glaciers that have been in motion for millions of years. Beneath, the ice water is circulating through subglacial channels that no instrument has directly observed, filling and draining the 400 lakes mapped by radar surveys, lubricating the base of the ice sheet, interacting with the geothermal heat rising from the rock below. The southern ocean surrounding the continent is in constant motion, forming dense cold water that sinks to the seafloor and spreads northward into every ocean basin on Earth, carrying with it the thermal signature of the Antarctic winter. The continent is not still. It is moving at speeds below the threshold of ordinary perception, doing the slow work of a system that operates on timescales that have no natural unit in human experience. Its apparent stillness is an artifact of our position in time, the position of beings who live for decades rather than millions of years, who perceive only the frame rather than the motion. The final image this episode leaves is not dramatic. It is a cold room and a shelf and a segment of ice no wider than a handspan, unmarked from the outside except by its catalogue number, holding inside it a quantity of ancient air so small that it would be invisible to the naked eye even if the ice were transparent. That segment will remain where it is. It will continue to hold what it holds. The atmosphere outside it will continue to change as it has always changed, and the record of those changes will continue to accumulate in that ice still forming on the Antarctic plateau, layer by layer, the way it has accumulated for the entire duration of the archive we have been tracing tonight. The record does not stop. It does not pause to be observed. It simply continues holding the past in one direction, accumulating the present in another, offering both to whoever arrives with the right tools and sufficient patience. The question we opened with what Antarctica may still be holding and whether we are capable of reading it does not close here. It does not close anywhere because the archive is still being written and the reading is still in early stages, and the distance between what is preserved and what is understood continues to narrow slowly in the way that all genuine distances narrow, not through revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of careful attention applied over long periods of time. That narrowing is not guaranteed to produce certainty. It is not designed to resolve into a final answer. It is simply the way that knowing works when the thing being known is larger than any single approach to it, deeper than any single instrument, older than any framework built to contain it. The ice holds, the bubbles persist, the buried rivers keep the shape of the water that carved them. Somewhere beneath 4 kilometers of compressed snow, a lake that has not seen light in 15 million years continues to be liquid, continues to be whatever it is, in the dark under pressure, patient in the way that only the unaware can be patient, which is to say completely and without end, not proof, a pattern. Rest more. Now. Traveller. We began with a cylinder of ice. 3.2 kilometers below the surface of East Antarctica, pulled slowly from the dark, sealed and transported, and held at temperatures that the place it came from would recognize. Inside it, air that last moved freely 800,000 years ago. That was the first detail this episode asked you to hold, and it is the last one worth returning to, not because it resolves anything, but because it remains exactly what it was when we first encountered it. Unchanged, still sealed, still containing what it contained before anyone knew to look for it. The cylinder did not become more mysterious as the night went on. If anything, it became more ordinary in the way that truly old things eventually become ordinary, when you sit with them long enough, not less significant but quieter, more settled into what they simply are. The traces we followed tonight did not arrive at a destination. They were never going to. A fossilized pollen grain from a tree that grew on ground now buried under kilometers of ice is not a clue pointing toward a conclusion. It is a remainder, something left over from a process so large and so slow that human categories of loss and discovery fit around it only loosely. The same is true of the air bubbles of the radar-mapped river channels of the water sealed in the dark beneath the ice sheet. None of them are waiting to be understood. They are simply persisting in the condition that circumstance produced for them, indifferent to whether that condition is studied or named or folded into a framework that makes it legible. There is a particular kind of rest available in that indifference. Not the rest of resolution, the settling that comes when a question finally closes, but something less tidy and more durable. The rest of recognizing that the record is larger than the reading of it. That the archive existed for hundreds of millions of years before the first instrument capable of reading it was constructed, and will continue to exist in whatever form the coming centuries allow it to keep long after the questions we are currently asking have been refined into questions we have not yet thought to ask. The not knowing is not a failure of attention. It is an accurate response to the actual scale of the thing. Some things are not too complex to understand. They are simply larger than any single understanding, and the correct relationship to them is not comprehension, but something more like companionship, a willingness to stay near them, to keep returning, to let them continue to be what they are, without requiring them to become something more manageable. Antarctica does not reward impatience. It never has. Every finding described tonight was the product of years of field seasons planned in advance and conducted in conditions that resist human presence, of samples transported carefully across hemispheres, of analyses refined through critique and replication, and the slow accumulation of methodological trust. The continent gives its information the way deep things always give their information, in increments to those willing to wait in forms that require work to interpret and humility to hold correctly. That is not a romantic quality. It is a physical one. The ice accumulates in layers because that is how snow works. The record extends as far back as it does because the conditions that preserve it have persisted for that long. The patience is not a virtue in the ice. It is a property of the system. If there is a question to carry into sleep, it is a gentle one. What else has the planet been keeping in materials and conditions we have not yet learned to read in the intervals between the records we already have? You do not need to answer it. It will be there in the morning and the morning after that, and for every morning that follows, for as long as the ice holds and the cold room stays cold and the bubbles remain sealed inside their ancient segments of compressed snow. The question is patient. It can wait. Let the cold room be cold. Let the ice remain where it is in its numbered segments on its shelves in the dark. Let the buried rivers keep their shapes. Let the lake beneath 4 kilometers of ice continue to be liquid in the dark under pressure, doing whatever it is doing, which may be nothing, or may be something, and which is either way no longer a problem for tonight. The record does not need you to finish reading it. It only needed you to begin. Sleep now. Let the weight of deep-tub time hold you the way ice holds what it has always held, gently, completely, without effort, for as long as the conditions allow. Rest now, traveller.